9:17 am Eastern Time. Somewhere inside a hardened command bunker beneath the Negev desert, an alarm is still ringing. Not a metaphorical alarm, a physical one, triggered 11 minutes ago when the first impact sensor registered a shockwave at the ADAMA chemical manufacturing plant inside Neot Hovav Industrial Zone, southern Israel. The plant produces pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. It sits inside a complex housing, more than 30 factories, warehouses, and energy installations. And right now, at 9:17 in the morning on a Sunday, it is on fire. Thick black smoke is climbing into the Negev sky. 3 hazardous materials response teams have been dispatched from Beersheba. Highway 40 is sealed. Every resident within proximity has been told to close their windows, shut off their air conditioning, and stay inside. And somewhere, in a room you don't know about yet, involving a person nobody is officially acknowledging, there is a message being drafted right now that could either end this war or blow it into something that changes the global economy for a decade. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Let's start with what just happened, because the details matter more than most people are being told. The missile strike on Neot Hovav is not some random salvo into the desert. This is day 30 of a war that began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. The Iranians have been firing back ever since. 8 separate salvos today alone, not counting simultaneous Hezbollah rocket attacks from Lebanon aimed at Safed and Tiberias. But today's strike is different. The IRGC isn't targeting military bases. They're targeting the industrial skeleton of the Israeli state, and Neot Hovav is the jugular. Here's what you need to know about this place. Neot Hovav is one of Israel's most critical industrial corridors. Some estimates place as much as half of the country's chemical production inside this single zone. It houses ammonia storage tanks. It handles hazardous waste treatment. It is the kind of facility that, if a serious warhead, not a fragment, not shrapnel, but a direct ballistic missile hit, connects squarely, you don't just get fire, you get a toxic cloud, you get an evacuation radius measured in kilometers, you get something that looks, on the evening news, less like a military exchange and more like a catastrophe. The IDF is currently saying that the ADAMA factory was struck by a missile fragment, not a direct hit. Environmental Protection Minister Edith Silman has gone on record saying testing shows no hazardous materials risk to the public, roads are reopening. But listen carefully to what that sentence means. A fragment of a ballistic missile hit a pesticide manufacturing plant with ammonia storage tanks inside Israel's primary chemical zone, and we're calling that the good outcome. That tells you exactly how dangerous this moment is. Now step back 30 days, February 28th, 2026. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner sat down in Geneva, indirectly, meaning no face-to-face, messages passed through intermediaries, with Iranian representatives. They were this close. Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi had already gone public, saying a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium. It had agreed to full IAEA verification. Al-Busaidi said peace was, quote, within reach. The next round of talks was scheduled for March 2nd. 2 days after Geneva, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The bombs fell first. The diplomats found out after. Signal number 1, this war started while the diplomats thought they were winning. So here we are, 30 days later. 8 Iranian salvos on a Sunday morning, Hezbollah firing from Lebanon, a chemical plant on fire in the Negev. And simultaneously, at this exact moment, somewhere in Islamabad, Pakistan's intelligence chief Lieutenant General Mohammad Asim Malik is in a room. Pakistan has become the courier, the messenger, the go-between in the most consequential back-channel diplomatic exchange since the Cuban Missile Crisis. On one side, Witkoff and Kushner, who've been texting Iranian officials and passing written proposals through multiple layers of intermediaries. On the other side, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who went on record this week saying flatly that, quote, no negotiations are taking place, while simultaneously acknowledging that the U.S. is, in fact, sending messages through mediators, which he clarified does not mean negotiations. Let that contradiction sit for a second. Messages are flowing, everyone is denying it. And the bombs haven't stopped. Here's what nobody is telling you publicly. The Iranian side has told the Trump administration it no longer wants to deal with Witkoff and Kushner. They don't trust them. Twice now, under the Trump administration, Iran has engaged in high-level diplomatic talks, and twice America has attacked Iran while those talks were ongoing. The Iranians have a word for that kind of pattern. They don't call it diplomacy. CNN is now reporting that Iranian representatives are specifically requesting that Vice President J.D. Vance be the American interlocutor going forward. Not Witkoff. Vance, and Trump has confirmed that Vance, Rubio, Kushner, and Witkoff are all currently leading negotiations. What that actually means in practice, who's in which room, who speaks for America, remains deliberately unclear. Turkey is passing messages. Pakistan is passing messages. Oman had a channel that the U.S. bombed its way out of. Qatar is both a mediating party and a country that, according to Channel 12 in Israel, launched its own military strikes against Iran after Iranian drones targeted Doha's international airport. This is the geopolitical equivalent of a knife fight in a phone booth. Everyone is bleeding. Everyone is still talking. No one is stopping. Now let's talk about the thing that will determine whether you're paying $4 a gallon for gas by summer or $9. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since March 4th. Not formally. Technically, a handful of Iranian and Chinese-flagged ships are still moving. But the London Insurance Market's Joint War Committee has made transit economically non-viable for the rest of the world. War risk insurance premiums are at 6-year highs. The result is the same as a lock on the door. Nobody's getting through. 20 million barrels of oil per day used to pass through that 21-mile-wide choke point between Iran and Oman. That's 27% of the world's maritime oil trade. It's now sitting still. Brent crude hit $126 per barrel at its peak this month, the first time above $100 since 2022. California gasoline surpassed $5 a gallon in the second week of March. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas is modeling that if the strait stays closed through the second quarter of 2026, WTI oil climbs to $98 a barrel in the most conservative scenario, and independent analysts are already pricing scenarios toward $200. Paul Sankey, an oil analyst who started his career at the International Energy Agency in 1990, said this week, and I'm paraphrasing him directly, he has never seen anything like this. Not since 1973. Not ever. The CEO of Kuwait Petroleum Corporation called it an attack not just on the Gulf, but on the world's economy being held hostage. Iraq and Kuwait have already begun curtailing oil well production because storage is filling up, because there's nowhere to send the oil. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are rushing product through the East-West pipeline to Yanbu and through the Abu Dhabi pipeline to Fujairah. But those pipelines can handle only a fraction of what the strait normally moves. The math doesn't work. The clock is ticking. And the window, according to oil executives, closes around mid-April, in roughly 3 weeks, before the supply disruption doubles in severity. That's the domino effect nobody's explaining clearly enough. If the strait stays closed through mid-April, the world loses 9 to 10 million barrels per day of supply, not 4.5. Goldman Sachs is already flagging scenarios where gasoline prices in the United States hit $3.50 in their moderate case. But oil analysts at BCA Research are projecting that number doubles to what it takes to collapse discretionary consumer spending across the American economy. Meanwhile, the US CPI for March just came in at 3.4% year-on-year, up from 2.4% in February, with rising fuel prices as the primary driver. Every Federal Reserve rate cut that Americans were hoping for this year has evaporated. The 10-year bond yield jumped to 4.46% on March 27th. The 30-year mortgage rate hit 6.38% a day later. The housing market, already fragile, is now being squeezed between war premiums and energy and rising long-term interest rates. But here's the catch. Not everyone in this story wants the war to end. And that's where it gets genuinely complicated. Benjamin Netanyahu is watching these negotiations the way a hawk watches a mouse that might escape. 2 Israeli sources confirmed this week to Axios that Netanyahu is deeply concerned Trump will cut a deal that, in the words of one of those sources, falls well short of Israel's objectives. What are Israel's objectives? They are not the same as Washington's. The IDF spokesman this week said publicly that within a few days, those were his exact words, the military expects to complete targeting all critical assets of Iran's military production industries. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, already announced the killing of Alireza Tangsiri, the head of the IRGC Navy, in an overnight strike. The IDF has conducted more than 140 strikes against Iranian regime infrastructure in just the past 24 hours. The Iraq heavy water nuclear reactor has been struck. Steel plants in Mobaraka, Isfahan, and Khuzestan, the industrial heart of the Iranian economy, have been hit. Israel is not slowing down. Israel is in fact speeding up. A person briefed on Israeli military operations told NPR this week that the IDF is accelerating its targeting over the next 48 hours, focusing specifically on arms factories, in case a ceasefire is declared before they can finish the job. Read that again. Israel is rushing to destroy targets before a ceasefire can stop them. That's not cooperation with American diplomatic efforts. That's a race against them. And the IRGC is watching every single strike. Every steel plant that burns, every industrial facility that collapses, every chemical zone that gets hit. Because the IRGC has been responding in kind. They struck 3 Israeli steel facilities earlier this month. They hit the ADAMA plant at Neot Hovav today. Iranian sources are already framing the Neot Hovav strike as a direct message. If Iran's industrial infrastructure continues to be dismantled, Israel's will be too. Tit for tat, factory for factory. And this is what systematic industrial warfare looks like. And it is happening in real time, on both sides. While diplomats are in Islamabad drafting frameworks for peace, here's what the American 15-point peace plan actually contains. The framework, which Pakistan delivered to Tehran and which Iran publicly labeled as maximalist and unreasonable, demands 0 uranium enrichment. Iran currently holds 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, enough, by Iran's own stated math, to produce 11 nuclear weapons. The US wants that gone. It wants Iran's ballistic missile program constrained. It wants Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, defanged. It wants the Strait of Hormuz reopened unconditionally. Iran's counterdemands include war reparations for damages inflicted during this conflict, sanctions relief, immediate and comprehensive, a permanent, legally binding guarantee that the US and Israel will never attack Iran again, and critically, a ceasefire that covers not just Iran but Lebanon, Iraq, and Gaza simultaneously. The gap between those two positions is not a negotiating gap. It is a chasm One U.S. source told CNN with crystalline clarity this week, the maximum Iran might be willing to give does not meet the minimum the U.S. is demanding. So why is anyone talking about a deal at all? Because of the third person in the room. The person I mentioned at the top and haven't named yet, that person is the global economy itself. Specifically, it is the American consumer who is now paying above $4 a gallon in many parts of the country, who is watching their mortgage rate climb, whose 401k is absorbing the S&P 500 volatility that comes standard with 100-plus oil. Trump's political coalition was built on a promise: lower prices, stronger economy, America wins. 30 days into this war, grocery bills are up. Energy costs are rising, inflation is reaccelerating. The political clock, not the military clock, the political clock, is the one that actually determines how long this war runs. And Trump's own behavior reveals that he's watching it. He personally went on Truth Social to announce a 10-day extension on his deadline for striking Iranian power plants, citing ongoing talks. He said talks are going very well. Hours later, he told reporters he doesn't care about a deal. Two contradictory messages in a single day. That's not confusion. That's a president feeling two separate pressures simultaneously. The hardliners who want Iran destroyed and the Treasury Secretary who is watching inflation numbers. Because here is the domino chain: if the strait stays closed, oil crosses $150. Goldman Sachs has already warned that if the strait's closure continues beyond 4 to 6 weeks, and we are already at 4 weeks, then the scenarios where prices don't ultimately reach $200 become increasingly optimistic. If oil hits $150, gasoline at the American pump crosses $7 in high-cost states. At $7, you get a consumer spending collapse. Retail spending drops 10-15% within 60 days. Airlines begin emergency capacity reductions. Trucking logistics, which depend entirely on diesel, begin to show delivery failures in the supply chain. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice: raise rates to fight inflation and risk recession, or hold rates and let inflation accelerate to 1970s levels. CNBC analysts this week said that 3 to 4 months after the strait closure, Gulf oil producers, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, could see a 30% collapse in annualized GDP because their wells are shutting in. Those are American allies. That is the coalition that the United States needs to hold together for any post-war regional security architecture to function. And Iran knows this. The IRGC's strategy is not to win a military war against the most powerful air force and carrier battle group assemblage in the world. Their strategy is to impose costs, to hold the strait as a lever, to wait out the political clock on the American side. Every day that Brent crude stays above $100 is a day that Washington's negotiating position gets slightly weaker. Every factory strike in Iran that leaves ordinary Iranians without jobs and heat generates domestic support for the hardliners, not the reformers who might be willing to make a deal. This is what asymmetric conflict at the strategic level actually looks like, and the Neot Hovav Strike this morning is a perfect illustration. The IRGC doesn't need to destroy the plant. It needs to make the fire visible. It needs the footage of black smoke over the Negev to circulate on social media. And right now, on X, the footage is everywhere. U.S. CENTCOM Chief Admiral Brad Cooper flew to Israel today. He met with IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir. They discussed the joint campaign against Iran. They discussed targeting Iran's weapons production industries. But quietly, behind that meeting, the question being asked in every intelligence briefing is the one that nobody wants to answer in public: what is the endgame? Because there are 3 paths and only 3. Israel's Strategic Affairs Minister Avi Falk laid them out explicitly this week. Remove the Iranian regime, decimate Iran's military capability to the point of collapse, or negotiate. His exact words: we can do all 3 at once. That is either a statement of strategic ambition or a statement of strategic confusion, and the difference between those two things is roughly $40 trillion of global economic damage. Pakistan is the key. Mohammad Ishaq Dar, Pakistan's foreign minister, confirmed this week that Islamabad is facilitating indirect U.S.-Iran communication and that the 15 American points are being deliberated upon in Tehran. Turkey's foreign minister Hakan Fidan is also carrying messages. Egypt's Badr Abdelhadi met with Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif this week. The shuttle has multiple shoes, multiple messengers, multiple capitals, and somewhere in the deliberate, structured ambiguity of that indirect architecture, a response is being formulated. Whether that response is a counterproposal or a new missile barrage is the question that defines the next 72 hours. Trump's extended deadline on Iranian power plant strikes expires April 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 8 days from now. Witkoff says there are strong signs Iran will capitulate to the logic of no alternatives. Iran says the American framework is disingenuous. The IRGC fired 8 salvos today. Hezbollah is shelling northern Israel from Lebanon, while Israeli ground forces push deeper into Lebanese territory. U.S. paratroopers and additional Marines are deploying to the region. Iran is reportedly laying traps on Karg Island, the massive oil terminal that represents Iran's primary export artery, in preparation for a potential U.S. ground assault. The IDF says within a few days it will complete targeting all critical Iranian military-industrial assets. And at Neot Hovav, the smoke is clearing. The roads are reopening. 1 person was lightly injured. The environmental ministry says the public is safe. The ADAMA plant, part of the Chinese-owned Syngenta Group, a detail that nobody in Washington is discussing loudly enough given U.S.-China tensions, is being assessed for damage. The ammonia tanks are intact. For now, so Here's where we are as Sunday, March 29th, 2026. Draws toward its afternoon hours. The war is 30 days old. 13 American service members have been killed. More than 30 people in Gulf Arab states are dead. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed for its 26th consecutive day, the longest closure in the waterway's modern history. Iran still holds 460 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. The IDF is accelerating strikes to finish jobs before a ceasefire stops them. Pakistan is carrying messages. Turkey is carrying messages. The IRGC is firing ballistic missiles at chemical zones. And a 10-day countdown clock, Trump's self-imposed deadline before he strikes Iranian power plants, is running. The next 24 to 72 hours are not complicated. They are binary. Either the message moving right now through Pakistani intelligence channels to Tehran carries a response, a real response, a counter framework, a signal from someone with actual authority in the Iranian system that a deal is possible. And both sides find a face-saving architecture that lets Trump declare victory, lets Iran preserve some shred of sovereignty, and lets the strait reopen before mid-April and the full economic collapse that follows. Or the strikes continue. The IRGC continues to fire. The gap between the 15-point American demand and Iran's 5 counter conditions continues to widen. The IDF finishes its accelerated targeting campaign. Trump's April 6th deadline arrives, and he has to choose between following through on his threat against Iranian power plants, which crosses into civilian infrastructure destruction and potentially triggers the very escalation that closes the strait permanently, or backing down publicly, which ends his leverage and extends the war indefinitely. There is no middle ground that holds much longer. There is no scenario where the strait closure extends to mid-May and the global economy shrugs. There is no scenario where the IRGC watches its steel mills and nuclear facilities and naval commanders get destroyed week after week and simply endures without escalation. There is no scenario where Benjamin Netanyahu, with an IDF that is right now, at this moment, rushing to destroy Iranian arms factories before a ceasefire can stop them, simply accepts a deal that leaves Iran with ballistic missiles, active proxies, and a path back to regional power. This is not a war that ends quietly. It ends with a deal. A real one, brokered in the next few days through the Pakistani channel, ratified through whoever in Tehran actually has the authority to say yes, or it doesn't end at all. Not in April, not in May. And the fire at Neot Hovav this morning, with its single lightly injured worker and its reopened roads and its official statement of no public risk, will look, in hindsight, like the last quiet moment before something much louder. Peace or war, deal or bombs, breakthrough or collapse. The clock says April 6th, the smoke says today.